My husband died and left me only debts. Every month I paid $500 for him. But one day the bank called me. Ma'am, your husband never had any debts. When I found out, good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Elaine Whitfield, and I was 67 years old when my world fell apart. Or rather, when I discovered it had already been falling apart for months, and I hadn't even known it. Raymond and I had been married for 31 years. 31 years of Sunday pancakes, of his old jazz records playing too loud in the kitchen, of arguments about the thermostat and roses in the garden that he planted every spring, even though his back ached something terrible. We weren't rich. We were comfortable. The quiet kind of comfortable that takes a lifetime to build. Raymond had worked as an electrical engineer for over 30 years, retired with a decent pension, and we owned our home outright in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. A white house on Maple Creek Drive with a porch swing that creaked. That creak was the most peaceful sound I'd ever known. Raymond died on a Tuesday in March, a heart attack. Sudden, merciless, without warning. One moment he was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, and the next he was gone. The doctor said he likely felt nothing. I've held on to that thought on the worst nights. What followed was the fog that anyone who has lost a spouse knows well. The funeral arrangements, the casseroles from neighbors, the paperwork that never seems to end. Raymond's son from his first marriage, Gregory, who everyone called Greg, flew in from Phoenix with his wife Denise. They stayed for the funeral, helped with some of the arrangements, and left after 4 days. I remember thinking they were grieving too, in their own way. I remember thinking we might lean on each other. I was wrong about many things that spring. 6 weeks after Raymond was buried, I received a letter. It was from a company called Meridian Financial Solutions, a debt collection agency. The letter stated that Raymond had an outstanding personal loan of $47,000, and that as his surviving spouse, I was being contacted regarding repayment. There was a payment plan outlined. $500 per month. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had died, and read that letter 3 times. I didn't recognize the creditor. I didn't recall Raymond ever mentioning a loan of that size. But grief does strange things to a person's confidence. It makes you doubt your own memory. Maybe he hadn't wanted to worry me. Maybe it had something to do with an old investment. I was not a woman who had handled the finances alone. Raymond had managed our accounts. I knew we had savings. I knew we had the pension. But I hadn't sat down with spreadsheets. Why would I have? We trusted each other completely. So I paid. The first month, I paid $500. Then the second month, I paid again. And the third. Each time, a hollow, sick feeling settled in my chest. But I told myself it was the responsible thing to do. Raymond would have wanted me to honor his obligations. That's what I believed. It was during the 5th month that something shifted. I had been trying to locate the original loan documents. My attorney had gently suggested I keep all paperwork organized for tax purposes. And I could not find a single record of this loan anywhere in Raymond's files. No promissory note, no bank correspondence, no entry in any of his financial folders, which were otherwise meticulous. Raymond had been an engineer. He kept records of everything: utility bills from 2003, receipts for appliances, his pension statements going back 15 years. But there was nothing, not a single piece of paper, that supported a $47,000 loan from Meridian Financial Solutions. I told myself there had to be an explanation. I told myself I was overwhelmed and possibly overlooking something. But then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Friday afternoon. I was in the garden, doing the weeding that Raymond used to do, trying to feel close to him in some small way. My phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. but I answered. A woman's voice, professional and calm, introduced herself as a representative from First Central Bank, where Raymond and I had held our joint accounts for over 20 years. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "I'm calling because we received a credit inquiry on your late husband's name, and I wanted to clarify something with you directly. According to all our records, and we've been your family's bank for a very long time. Mr. Raymond Whitfield never carried any personal debt with us or any affiliated institution. He had no outstanding loans at the time of his passing. His credit history was completely clean. I stood in the garden with dirt on my gloves and my heart hammering in my chest. "Ma'am," I said slowly, "are you absolutely certain?" "Yes, Mrs. Whitfield, completely certain. His record shows 0 outstanding debt." I thanked her and hung up. I stood there for a long time among Raymond's roses, the May sun warm on my face, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. 5 months. I had paid $500 a month for 5 months, $2,500, to a company that claimed my husband owed them money, and my husband, according to the bank that had known us for 2 decades, had never had a single debt in his life. Who had sent me that letter, and why? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed that still smelled faintly of Raymond's soap. I hadn't washed his pillow, I confess. And I stared at the ceiling and tried to think clearly. $2,500. That was the first number I wrote down the next morning, sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that went cold before I touched it. 5 payments of $500, each one withdrawn from my checking account, each one sent by certified mail to a P.O. box in Arizona. I pulled out every receipt, every payment stub, every piece of correspondence I had kept from Meridian Financial Solutions. I spread them across the table and read them again. This time, not as a grieving widow trying to do the right thing, but as a woman who suspected she had been robbed. The letterhead looked professional enough. There was a logo, a phone number, a reference number for the account. But as I looked more carefully, certain things began to feel off. The address was a P.O. box, not a physical office. The phone number, when I tried it, rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail. The original letter had arrived 6 weeks after Raymond's death. A very convenient timing, I now realized. Long enough for the obituary to have been published. Long enough for someone to have known I was alone and overwhelmed. Someone had read Raymond's obituary and decided I was an easy target. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I am not a woman given to dramatic emotion. I was a schoolteacher for 28 years, 4th grade, and you learn to keep your composure when everything around you is chaos. But sitting at that table with Raymond's photograph on the wall behind me, I felt something I hadn't felt since his death. Not grief. Anger. I got up, rinsed my coffee cup, and made a fresh pot. Then I sat back down and started writing. I listed everything I knew. The name of the company, the P.O. box address, the dates and amounts of every payment, the reference number on the letters, the phone number that went to voicemail. I wrote down the name of the woman from First Central Bank and the date of her call. I wrote down the fact that Raymond's financial files, meticulous, thorough, contained no record of this debt whatsoever. Then I started asking myself harder questions. Who knew about Raymond's death quickly enough to act within 6 weeks? The obituary had been published in the local paper and online. Anyone could have seen it. But the letter had included Raymond's full name, our home address, and a reference to his outstanding personal account. Details that suggested someone who had either researched us carefully or already knew us. I thought about Greg. I didn't want to think about Greg. He was Raymond's son, and whatever friction had existed between us over the years, and there had been friction, mostly over Raymond's estate, which Greg had believed should be more heavily divided in his favor. I had never considered him capable of something like this. But the facts were the facts. Greg had been in our home for 4 days after the funeral. He had access to Raymond's office where all the financial records were kept. He had always known we had no debt. He was currently living in Phoenix, Arizona, and Meridian Financial Solutions had a P.O. box in Arizona. I wrote Greg's name at the top of a fresh page. Then I wrote Denise's name beneath it. Then I drew a line and wrote, motive, means, opportunity. It was a working theory, nothing more. But it was enough to make me stop paying. That same afternoon, I called Meridian Financial Solutions again and let it ring to voicemail. This time, I did not leave a message. Instead, I wrote down the exact wording of the voicemail greeting, a flat, automated message that gave no company name, only a 5-digit extension number. A legitimate debt collection agency is legally required to identify itself. This one did not. By evening, I had made 3 decisions. First, I would not make another payment, not a single dollar. Second, I would contact an attorney, not to ask for advice, but to begin building a case. I had a friend from church, Margaret, whose son-in-law was a consumer protection lawyer in Columbus. I would call her in the morning. Third, I would not say a word to Greg or Denise. Not yet. If they were behind this, I didn't want them to know I had stopped believing their lie. Let them think I was still the confused, grieving old woman they'd apparently counted on. Was it possible I was wrong? Of course. I might have been a lonely widow grasping for an explanation that made her pain feel like someone else's fault. I knew that. But I also knew Raymond. And Raymond Whitfield did not have secret debts. He did not make financial decisions without telling me. And he most certainly did not borrow $47,000 and leave me with nothing but a P.O. box in Arizona. I went to bed that night with the legal pad on the nightstand and Raymond's photograph facing me from the dresser. I looked at him for a long time. "I'm going to figure this out," I said out loud to the empty room. "I promise you I will." The porch swing creaked outside in the evening wind. It sounded just for a moment like an answer. Margaret Hooper had been my friend since our children were in elementary school together, which meant she had known me through good times and bad. And when I called her at 7:30 in the morning, she didn't ask unnecessary questions. She simply said, "Daniel is in the office by 9. I'll call him right now." Daniel Cho was 38, compact, precise, and had the kind of steady eyes that made you feel your problem was already halfway solved. I drove to Columbus on a Wednesday morning with my folder of documents. Every letter, every payment receipt, every note from my legal pad, and sat across from him in a small conference room that smelled of coffee and printer ink. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, took his own notes, and at the end he leaned back and said, "Mrs. Whitfield, what you're describing is a textbook bereavement scam. They target surviving spouses within weeks of an obituary publication. The amount is deliberately set low enough that most people pay without question rather than deal with the stress of a dispute." Low enough. $500 a month felt significant to me on a fixed income, but I understood what he meant. "Can we prove it's fraud?" I asked. "We're going to find out," he said. "I'm going to file a request under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act for full documentation of this alleged debt, original loan agreement, payment history, account origination records. They're legally required to provide it. If this is a legitimate debt, those documents will exist. If it isn't," he paused, "they'll either produce forgeries or go silent. Either way, we'll know." He also advised me to contact the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Office and file an initial complaint, which would create an official timestamp on my case. I did it that same afternoon, sitting in his office on a form that took 20 minutes to fill out. There. It was real now. It was on record. I drove home feeling something I hadn't expected. Lighter. Not happy. Nothing about this was happy. but purposeful. I was no longer a woman things were happening to. I was a woman who was doing something. What I didn't know then was that something had already been set in motion on the other end. 3 days after my meeting with Daniel, I received a text message from Greg. That in itself was unusual. Greg and I were not close, and our communication since the funeral had been limited to a single phone call in April, during which he had asked about the timeline for probate. The text read, "Hi, Dorothy. Denise and I have been thinking about you. Hope you're doing okay. Any news on the estate?" I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the counter and thought carefully. He was fishing? He wanted to know how things stood, whether I was asking questions, talking to lawyers, making noise. I didn't respond that day. I told myself I needed to think about what to say, but really, I just wasn't ready to look into that particular darkness yet. Daniel called me 11 days after our meeting. "Dorothy," he said. We had moved to first names by then. "I've received a response to our documentation request." "And?" A short pause. "There are no documents. They sent back a letter stating that the account records are unavailable due to a data migration issue, and that they are working to retrieve archived files. It's a stall tactic. No legitimate creditor loses the originating documents for a $47,000 loan. That simply doesn't happen." I gripped the phone. "But that's not the most important thing I found," Daniel continued. "I did some research on Meridian Financial Solutions. The company was registered in Arizona 14 months ago, just over a year before Raymond's death. The registered agent is a man named Carl Bowick. He has 2 prior fraud convictions in Nevada. And the P.O. box used for all correspondence? It was opened in the name of a woman named Denise Patricia Fowler." The room went very still. Denise Patricia Fowler was Denise's maiden name. I knew this because it had been on the wedding program from when she and Greg married 12 years ago. A program I had kept in a box of family papers without ever imagining I would need it as evidence. "Daniel," I said very quietly, "I have that program. I have her maiden name in writing." "Then we have our link," he said. "This isn't a theory anymore, Dorothy. This is evidence." I hung up the phone and sat in Raymond's armchair, the old blue one in the corner of the living room that no one ever sat in but him, and I felt the full weight of what I now knew. My stepson and his wife had read my husband's obituary, waited 6 weeks for the sharpest edge of my grief to dull slightly, and then sent me a fraudulent debt notice, betting that a 67-year-old widow would pay quietly rather than fight. They had collected $2,500 from me, and they had intended to collect much more. I wasn't crying. I had expected tears, rage tears, grief tears, the kind that come when betrayal and loss arrive together. But there were none. What I felt instead was a cold, clear, absolute certainty. This was not going to end the way they had planned. Daniel moved quickly once we had the link to Denise's maiden name. He filed a formal complaint with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, as well as with the Arizona Attorney General's office, since that was where Meridian Financial Solutions had been registered. He also contacted the Ohio State Highway Patrol's Fraud Division, which had jurisdiction over crimes affecting Ohio residents. Simultaneously, he sent a formal cease and desist letter to the P.O. Box address, citing the fraudulent debt scheme, the lack of documentation, and the identity of the registered party. It was a careful, thorough, legal offensive. And somewhere between the filing of those complaints and the mailing of that cease and desist letter, Greg found out. I don't know exactly how it happened. Perhaps someone contacted him as part of the investigation, or perhaps he had a contact at the P.O. Box address who flagged the letter. But on a Thursday evening, 12 days after Daniel's call, my phone rang. It was Greg. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Dorothy," he said, and his voice had a hard edge I had never heard from him before. "I hear you've been talking to lawyers." I kept my voice even. "I've been handling some estate matters, yes. Estate matters." He said it slowly, as if tasting the words. "Is that what you're calling it? Is there something specific you wanted to discuss, Greg?" There was a pause. The kind of pause that comes when someone is deciding how honest to be. Then Denise's voice came on the line, and I realized I was on speaker. "Dorothy, we think this has all been a misunderstanding," she said. Her tone was warm and smooth, the way a blade can be warm if the light hits it right. "We're family. We don't want things to get ugly." "No one wants things to get ugly," I said. "Then maybe pull back on whatever you've started," Greg said, the warmth entirely gone now. "Dad's gone. Let it be. You don't know what you're getting into, and honestly, at your age, you don't need this stress." At your age, as if age was a vulnerability they could use. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I'm managing the stress just fine." "Dorothy," Greg's voice dropped, "I'm going to be very direct with you. If you push this, it's going to affect the probate. Dad's estate isn't fully settled, and things can get complicated. Very complicated. Legal challenges to asset distribution can drag on for years. I'm just saying, it would be easier for everyone if this whole thing just went away." There it was, a threat dressed as advice. I had expected it. Daniel had warned me there might be pushback once the complaints were filed. But knowing it was coming and hearing it are two different things. My hand tightened on the phone. "Greg," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice was. "I have already spoken with my attorney about the estate, and there is nothing to be threatened with there. Everything is in order. As for the other matter, that is now in the hands of federal and state investigators, and it is no longer something either you or I can simply make go away." A long silence. "You made a mistake," Greg said. "Perhaps," I said. "I'll find out." And I hung up. I sat in the kitchen for a while, the phone on the table in front of me, waiting to feel frightened. There was fear. Yes, a cold, crawling kind. The sort you feel when someone reminds you that the world is not as safe as you've allowed yourself to believe. Greg was not a gentle man underneath his surface charm. I knew that now. And Denise was sharper than she seemed, but I had done everything right. The complaints were filed, the evidence was secured. Daniel had copies of everything. I had already mailed originals of all documents to his office. Nothing remained in my house alone. There was very little Greg could do to me legally, and I believed, in some deep and settled part of myself, that he knew it. He called twice more over the next 2 days. I let it go to voicemail. His messages started formal and ended heated. Denise left one message that was entirely warm, entirely falsely warm, offering to come to Columbus to talk things through in person. I did not return any of them. On the 5th day, the calls stopped. Daniel said this was likely because they'd been contacted by investigators. "When official inquiries start," he told me, "people tend to get very quiet. I decided I had earned a few days of rest." My neighbor Carol, a retired nurse who had been dropping off soup since March, came over on Saturday, and we sat on the porch and drank sweet tea and didn't talk about any of it. We talked about her grandchildren and a book she was reading, and the state of the roses in my front garden, which had bloomed magnificently and which I had tended as carefully as Raymond ever had. I sat in the porch swing and let it creak beneath me and thought, I am still here. I am still standing. That was enough for those few days. That was exactly enough. The temptation arrived by mail. I almost missed it. It came in a plain white envelope with no return address, postmarked Phoenix. and I nearly set it aside with the sympathy cards that still occasionally arrived from Raymond's former colleagues. But something about the weight of it made me open it at the mailbox rather than inside. It was a personal check made out to Dorothy Whitfield. The amount was $5,000. There was no note, no letter, no explanation. Only the check. The account it was drawn from was a personal account, not a business account, and the name on the account was Gregory Allen Whitfield. I stood at the end of the driveway for a long moment. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked somewhere on the next street. The May air was warm and smelled of cut grass. $5,000, more than double what I had already paid them, delivered without a word, no apology, no admission, no context, just money in an envelope with my name on it. It was a buyout. Pay her enough to make her stop. Make it look like a good faith gesture while leaving no paper trail of acknowledgement or guilt. I took a photograph of the check with my phone, right there in the driveway. Then I put it back in the envelope, brought it inside, and called Daniel. "Don't touch it," he said immediately. "Don't deposit it. Don't endorse it. I want that envelope and check in my office by tomorrow morning." "I understand," I said. "Dorothy, this is actually helpful to our case. It demonstrates consciousness of guilt. No innocent party sends an unexplained check for $5,000 in the middle of a fraud investigation." That was exactly what I had thought, standing at the mailbox. I am a retired school teacher, not a lawyer, but I have always had a certain clarity about people's motives. Children will surprise you in a classroom by trying to get away with things in ways that prove exactly what they did wrong. Adults are not so very different. I did not call Greg. I did not acknowledge the check in any way. I simply let it enter the hands of my attorney, and then I went about my week. What I had not expected was how isolating the whole experience had become. It is one thing to be wronged. It is another to carry the knowledge of it largely alone, unable to talk to most people because the case was ongoing, and Daniel had advised discretion. Raymond's friends didn't know. My children, I have a daughter, Patricia, who lives in Seattle, knew only that I was handling some financial matters related to the estate. I hadn't wanted to worry her or to say anything definitive before I was certain. But the silence was its own kind of weight. That was when Marla found me, or rather when I finally let her find me. Marla DeVries ran a support group for widows and widowers out of a local church. Not a grief group exactly, more of a practical life group for people navigating all the things that come after loss. Bills, loneliness, home repairs, scams. She had been mentioned to me by 3 different people since Raymond died, and I had resisted for months because I didn't think I needed a group. I was managing. I was coping. I showed up on a Tuesday evening because I had run out of reasons not to. There were 8 of us in a circle of folding chairs in the church fellowship hall with bad coffee and decent cookies. A man named Howard had nearly lost his house to a roofing contractor who had taken a large deposit and disappeared. A woman named Bev had discovered her late husband had a second cell phone. A retired school teacher named Liz had, and this stopped me cold, been contacted by a debt collection company 2 months after her husband died. A different company, different amount. Same pattern. I leaned forward in my chair. "What was the name of the company?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "Summit Credit Recovery, out of Nevada. Not the same as Meridian, but the same structure. A P.O. box, a reference number, a debt that couldn't be verified." After the meeting, I asked Liz if she would speak with my attorney. She said yes, without hesitation. As it turned out, she was only one of several people in the region who had received similar letters. Daniel later told me that investigators were already looking at a broader network of connected shell companies. Meridian Financial Solutions may have been just one node in something considerably larger. I drove home that night, feeling, for the first time in months, genuinely less alone. Not because the problem was smaller, it wasn't, but because I understood now that I was not the only one who had been targeted. These people were predators, and predators rely on their victims' isolation and shame to stay safe. I was neither isolated nor ashamed. Not anymore. They came on a Saturday. I hadn't been warned because I hadn't given them the chance to warn me. I'd stopped answering their calls entirely, and Daniel was handling all direct communication. But nothing in our legal strategy prevented Greg and Denise from simply getting into their car, driving from Phoenix to Columbus, and appearing at my front door. I heard the car in the driveway at 11 in the morning. I looked through the window and saw a dark blue rental car and Greg unfolding himself from the driver's side, followed by Denise in a cream-colored blouse and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I thought about not answering the door, but then I thought, let them come. Let them say what they've come to say. I want to see it. I opened the door before they knocked. Greg looked older than he had at the funeral. His face had a pinched quality, as if he'd spent the last several weeks not sleeping well. Denise was immaculate as always, her blonde hair smooth, her posture straight, her expression carefully composed into something resembling concern. "Dorothy," she said, stepping forward slightly, "we've been so worried about you." "Come in," I said, and I held the door open and let them into my living room and offered them nothing. We sat, they on the couch, me in the armchair across from them, Raymond's armchair. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Greg spoke first. He said that they had been doing a lot of thinking. He said that families go through hard times, especially after a loss. He said that obviously there had been some confusion, a word he used 3 times in 4 sentences, around some financial paperwork, and that they felt terrible that it had caused me stress. He said the check had been their attempt to express that, to make things right. Then Denise leaned forward and said very gently, "Dorothy, we know you've been talking to lawyers, and we understand why. You were confused, and you were scared, and you wanted someone to tell you what to do. But these things have a way of spiraling, and once investigators get involved, it stops being about the truth and starts being about who can afford more legal representation. Ray wouldn't have wanted you to spend what's left of his estate on attorney fees." There it was. Ray. She called him Ray. She had never called him Ray while he was alive. She had always called him Mr. Whitfield, with a smile that said she found him mildly inconvenient. And here she was, using the shortened name he'd only allowed to his closest friends to tell me that my dead husband would have wanted me to drop my fraud case against his son. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I looked at Greg. "I've heard what you've said," I told them. "My attorney will continue to handle all of this. If there's something specific you'd like to communicate to him, I'll give you his contact information." Greg's jaw tightened. "Dorothy, I'm trying to keep this civil." "So am I said. "That's why I suggested your attorney contact mine." Denise tried once more. She talked about the stress on all of them. She talked about the holidays coming up. She talked about how sad it was that Raymond's family was being torn apart. When none of that moved me, she shifted. "You're making yourself a target," she said very quietly. "People who push back on these kinds of investigations, it tends to reflect badly on everyone involved, including you." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, and I stood up, which meant they were being asked to leave. Greg stood slowly. His face had changed. The careful, controlled expression was gone. What replaced it was something I can only describe as ugly, not in the way of features, but in the way of intention. "You have no idea what you've started," he said. "I know exactly what I've started," I said. "I started it the day your father's bank called and told me he had never had a single debt in his life." They left. I locked the door behind them, And then I stood in my living room, and I was shaking. Not violently, just a fine, persistent tremor in my hands, the way you shake when adrenaline has nowhere left to go. I went to the kitchen and ran cold water over my wrists, the way my mother used to tell me to, and I breathed. There was fear in that shaking, real fear. Greg's final words had not been an empty gesture. There was something in his voice, a flatness, that told me he meant them as a warning. But here is what I knew standing at my kitchen sink. The fear did not make me want to stop. It made me want to finish. I called Daniel that afternoon and told him they had visited in person. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Good. Document it. Time, date, what was said. This is relevant." "Already done," I told him. I had written it down while they were still in the driveway. "Dorothy," he said. And there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. A kind of quiet respect, the kind you earn rather than are given. "You're doing everything right?" I went to bed that night with the bedroom door locked and Raymond's photograph on the nightstand. Fear and resolve, I had learned, are not opposites. They feed each other, if you let them. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in October, 7 months after I had received that first fraudulent letter. It was not a criminal trial. That would come later, and I will get to that. This was a civil fraud hearing before a federal magistrate related to the FBI and Arizona AG complaints that Daniel had filed. Greg and Denise had hired an attorney, a man named Patterson, who specialized in financial cases and had a reputation for procedural delays. He had, in fact, managed to delay the hearing twice already. By the third scheduling, however, the magistrate had made it clear she would not tolerate further postponement. I drove to the federal courthouse in Columbus on a gray October morning. I wore a navy blue suit that I had bought for Raymond's retirement party 12 years ago and which still fit me well, and I carried a leather folder with copies of every document Daniel had prepared. Carol came with me and sat in the gallery. Marla came too. She had become a genuine friend, not just a support group contact, and she pressed my hand in the hallway outside the courtroom and said, "You've already won, Dorothy. Today is just paperwork." I wasn't sure about that, but I was steady. I had not slept particularly well the night before. I had lain awake going over every document in my mind, rehearsing facts the way I used to rehearse my lesson plans before the first day of school. Not because I didn't know the material, but because I needed to feel it settled inside me before I walked into the room. By the time 4 in the morning came and went, I had stopped trying to sleep and simply sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea. Raymond's photograph on the wall and the quiet house around me. I had thought, whatever happens today, I did not look away. I did not pay and be silent. That is already something no one can take back. Daniel had laid out our case with the precision of someone who had been building it carefully for months. The documentation was extensive. The original fraudulent letter, the payment records showing my 5 monthly payments, the bank confirmation from First Central that Raymond carried no debt, the Arizona Corporation filing showing Meridian Financial Solutions registered only 14 months before Raymond's death, the P.O. Box registration in Denise's maiden name, the testimony from Liz, the widow from my support group, showing the same scheme had been applied to at least one other grieving spouse, and the unexplained $5,000 check from Greg, still undeposited, which Daniel had entered into evidence as an indication of guilt. Patterson, Greg, and Denise's attorney had argued that the P.O. Box registration was coincidental, that Denise Patricia Fowler was a common enough name that the connection to his client was not conclusive. He argued that the check was a personal gift from a stepson to his father's widow, nothing more. He argued that Meridian Financial Solutions was a legitimate business that had perhaps made an administrative error in contacting Mrs. Whitfield. But the magistrate, a compact woman in her 50s named Judge Harlan, had not been impressed with these explanations. She had asked Patterson very calmly for the original loan documentation. He produced nothing. She asked for any communication between Meridian Financial Solutions and Raymond Whitfield during his lifetime. There was none. She asked for the identity of Carl Bowick, the registered agent, and how he was connected to the Whitfields. Patterson said he was not in a position to speak to that at this time. Judge Harlan looked at him over her glasses for a long moment. There was no drama in her expression, only the steady, practiced attention of someone who had heard many explanations and learned to recognize the ones that meant nothing. She set down her pen and folded her hands on the bench, and in the silence that followed, the only sound in the courtroom was the faint scratch of the court reporter's keys. Then she turned to Greg and Denise. They were seated at the respondent's table, Greg in a dark suit, Denise in gray, both of them with the careful, composed expressions of people who had been coached thoroughly on how to appear in court. But composure, I have learned, is only as strong as the ground beneath it. The judge asked Greg directly, had he ever had any relationship with Meridian Financial Solutions? Greg said no. The judge asked Denise, had she ever used or been associated with the name Denise Patricia Fowler for any business or financial purposes? Denise said no. Daniel then presented to the court a notarized copy of a 2011 document, a notarized signature card from the P.O. Box registration, bearing the name Denise Patricia Fowler and a thumbprint. He also presented a copy of Greg and Denise's 2012 wedding program, which listed her full legal name, Denise Patricia Fowler Whitfield, formerly Fowler. The room was very quiet. Denise said something to Patterson in a low, urgent voice. Patterson put his hand on her arm. Greg was staring at the document on the table as if he could make it disappear through concentration alone. I watched his jaw tighten, then release, then tighten again. I watched Denise smooth the front of her jacket with a hand that was not entirely steady. They had prepared for many things. They had not prepared for a wedding program from 2012 that a woman had kept in a box of family papers for over a decade without knowing she would ever need it. That is the thing about careful people. They plan for the questions they expect. They do not always plan for the quiet documents sitting in someone's guest closet, Judge Harlan said, with an evenness that somehow conveyed everything. Mrs. Whitfield, let the record reflect that the respondents have been unable to provide any documentation supporting the existence of the alleged debt, and that the registered identity associated with the P.O. box used in correspondence has now been directly linked to respondent Denise Whitfield via biometric and documentary evidence. She turned back to Patterson. Counsel, at this point, I'd strongly advise your clients to consider their position very carefully. Patterson leaned toward Greg and spoke quietly. Greg shook his head. Denise put her hand flat on the table, and I could see, from across the room, that it was trembling. Then Greg said, and I don't think he meant to say it as loudly as he did, she can't prove we sent the letter. Patterson closed his eyes briefly, and the magistrate said, very calmly, the question of who sent the letter is a matter for criminal proceedings, Mr. Whitfield. In this hearing, we're addressing fraud as it pertains to Mrs. Whitfield's civil claim, and the evidence before me is clear. I sat at the plaintiff's table with my hands folded, and I looked at them, my stepson and his wife, who had decided that a grieving old woman would be an easy mark, and I felt nothing dramatic. No triumph, not yet. Just a still, clear, quiet certainty. The ground had gone out from under them, and they were only just realizing it. Judge Harlan issued her civil ruling 12 days after the hearing. I read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, with Carol sitting across from me and Daniel on the phone. It was 41 pages long, and Daniel summarized it. The court found clear and convincing evidence of a fraudulent debt scheme targeting Dorothy Elaine Whitfield following the death of her husband. It ordered full restitution of the $2,500 I had paid, plus interest. It awarded additional damages totaling $47,000, the original amount of the alleged fraudulent debt. A figure the court determined represented the intended scope of the scheme. It referred the matter to federal prosecutors for criminal investigation. $49,500 returned to me, plus the ongoing criminal referral. Carol reached across the table and covered my hand with hers and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. There are moments that don't need words. The morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across the papers on the table, and I thought about the first time I had sat at that same table with a fraudulent letter in my hands, reading it 3 times because I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing. I had believed it eventually. I had believed the wrong thing. And then I had stopped believing it, and that had made all the difference. The criminal case moved more quickly than anyone expected, largely because Carl Bowick, the registered agent of Meridian Financial Solutions, had, under federal questioning, agreed to cooperate fully with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony provided the chain of communication between himself, Greg, and Denise, including email records and wire transfer documentation that had been subpoenaed from their accounts. It turned out that Meridian Financial Solutions was not the only shell company in their network. They had, over the previous 3 years, created 4 separate fraudulent debt entities and targeted 31 surviving spouses in 7 states. I was not the first. I was not the smallest target. But I was the one who hadn't stopped at the first phone call. The federal case against Gregory Allen Whitfield and Denise Patricia Whitfield was filed in November. They were charged with wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and a specialized charge related to elder financial exploitation. A federal designation that carries enhanced penalties specifically because it targets people over 65, which I was. They had hired a new attorney by then. Patterson had quietly stepped aside, citing conflicts of interest, and the new attorney immediately began negotiations, presumably hoping for a plea arrangement. The federal prosecutors, Daniel told me, were not inclined toward generosity. The evidence was extensive. The victim count was 31, and the scheme had been deliberate, organized, and predatory. Daniel told me that in his 15 years of consumer protection law, he had rarely seen a case with documentation this clean. I thought about Raymond's filing system, the meticulous folders going back to the 1990s, and thought, he helped me, even from wherever he is now. I did not attend the sentencing. I had been asked if I wanted to provide a victim impact statement, and I had spent a long evening considering it. In the end, I wrote one. Not out of rage. The rage had long since burned into something steadier. But because it mattered that the court understood what this kind of crime costs people who can least afford to bear it. I wrote about Raymond, and about the fog of grief, and about how the first payment had felt like honoring his memory, even as it was stealing from it. I wrote about the sleepless nights, the fear after Greg's phone call, the afternoon they appeared at my door with their rehearsed concern and their hollow smiles. I wrote that I hoped the court would consider not just what had been taken from me, but what had nearly been taken from me and from 30 others who had already lost someone they loved. Greg received 4 years in federal prison. Denise received 3 years and 8 months, with an additional period of supervised release. They were also jointly ordered to pay restitution to all 31 victims, a total that exceeded $200,000. I heard about the sentencing from Daniel on a Friday afternoon in January, standing in my kitchen with afternoon light coming through the window and a pot of soup on the stove. He said, "It's done, Dorothy. Full sentences, full restitution order." "Thank you," I said, "for everything." "You did the work," he said. After I hung up, I stood for a while at the kitchen window, looking at the garden. The roses were bare in January, cut back for winter the way Raymond had always done. But the structure of the garden was there, the shape of it. Waiting. I thought about Raymond, the way I still did every single day. I thought about how he would have been furious, and then methodical, and then quietly satisfied. He had been that kind of man. I think he would have been proud of me. I put on my coat and went out onto the porch and sat in the swing and let it creak in the January cold. And I breathed the winter air, and I thought, it is done. The check, the letters, the fear, the midnight calculations at the kitchen table, the drive to Columbus in a suit I hadn't worn in 12 years. All of it had led to this. A cold January afternoon, a bare garden, a creaking swing, and me still in it. Spring came the way it always had, indifferent to what had happened in my life, and generous anyway. The roses I had tended through those difficult months came back extravagantly in April. More blooms than I could count. Deep red against the white porch railings, exactly the way Raymond had always grown them. Patricia flew in from Seattle for a week in May, and we sat on the porch swing together, and I told her the whole story for the first time. She cried, which surprised me, and then she was angry, which didn't. And then she hugged me for a long time and said, "Mom, I don't know if I would have done what you did." "You would have," I told her. "You are your father's daughter as much as mine." That summer, I did something I had been thinking about since the support group. I began volunteering with a local elder fraud awareness program, a small nonprofit that partnered with senior centers, churches, and community groups to educate older adults about bereavement scams and financial exploitation. I helped develop a plain language guide for surviving spouses on what to do when they received suspicious debt notices. Daniel helped me review the legal sections. Marla distributed it through her network. The guide was eventually adopted by 3 county senior services offices. I also took a long trip to visit Patricia in Seattle in September, something I had been putting off for 2 years, first because of Raymond's health decline, and then because of grief, and then because of everything that followed. Patricia and I drove up to Vancouver Island for 5 days and walked by the ocean and ate seafood and talked about her children, my grandchildren, who were growing so fast it hurt to think about. I came home with color in my face and sand in my shoes, and feeling, genuinely, that the second chapter of my life was livable, more than livable. The restitution payments arrived over the course of the following 18 months, drawn from the liquidation of Greg and Denise's assets as ordered by the court. I put every dollar into a certificate of deposit and did not touch it, except for the original $2,500, which I donated, every cent, to the Elder Fraud nonprofit. It seemed right. The money had been taken from grief. Let it go back to protecting people in grief. As for Greg and Denise, I heard things, as one does in a legal matter that has produced public records. Greg was housed at a federal correctional facility in Kentucky. Denise served her sentence at a minimum security facility in West Virginia. Their house in Phoenix was sold by court order to partially fund the restitution payments. Their joint bank accounts were seized. By the time the legal fees, the restitution orders, and the asset forfeitures were settled, they had, as far as anyone could determine, very little left. What struck me was not the severity of the consequences. They had been severe, and they had been earned, but the smallness of what it had all been for. $47,000. That was the number on the letter. That was what they had set their sights on when they looked at a 67-year-old widow in a white house with a creaking porch swing and decided she was worth taking from. They had lost their freedom, their home, their assets, and, I suspected, though I didn't know, whatever there had once been between the two of them. Shared crimes have a way of eroding the people who commit them together. Raymond's estate was settled cleanly. Because Raymond had updated his will in 2018, a fact I hadn't known until the probate process began, the bulk of his estate came to me, with a specific bequest to Patricia and a modest one to Greg that the court later ordered redirected to the restitution pool. It was not a fortune, but it was the life Raymond had built, intact, held in trust by a man who had known exactly whom he trusted. On the anniversary of his death, a Tuesday in March, gray and cold the way it had been the year before, I went out to the garden and stood among the bare roses and talked to him the way I sometimes did. I told him that his son was in prison, which I imagined he already knew. I told him that I was well, which I thought would matter to him more. I told him that the porch swing still creaked. I told him that Patricia looked more like him every year, which was a comfort and an ache in equal measure. Then I went inside and made pancakes because it was Sunday, and that had been our tradition, and some traditions deserve to outlast the loss that shadows them. Looking back now, I can tell you this. Grief makes you vulnerable in ways you don't expect. It doesn't only break your heart. It breaks your guard. And there are people in this world who know that, who watch the obituaries and count the weeks and calculate the moment when a widow or a widower is too exhausted and too trusting to ask the right questions. What I learned is this: ask the questions anyway, check the documents, call your bank, and never, never be ashamed of fighting for what's yours, especially when the person who took it was counting on your shame to protect them. If this had been you, if that letter had arrived at your door 6 weeks after the hardest loss of your life, what would you have done? I'd love to know. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you know someone who might need to hear this story, please share it. Thank you for being here with me today.